Welcome to the Two Beans in a Pod by Haley and Jamie. Today we're doing a deep dive into some really complex and tangled topics. We're looking at the continued fallout from the Jeffrey Epstein files. It's really become this whole Epstein-Gate thing, and, well, how all of this raises some big questions about what's next for the Trump administration, especially with everything else going on. There's a lot to get through, so let's try and unpack it together. Okay, let's start with the Middle East. Our sources, well, they're painting a pretty bleak picture. Things seem really volatile. What's the main dynamic people are describing?
Indeed. Judge Andrew Napolitano recently had Professor John Mearsheimer on, and Mearsheimer laid out a very clear view of Iran's strategies, both defensive and potentially offensive, against Israel and the U.S. Mearsheimer's point is that Iran, they're under no illusions about who they're up against. They're constantly thinking about defense, but also how to counter Israel if needed.
Right, and this is where Mearsheimer brings in the Trump administration, and it gets really interesting. He specifically says Trump's bombing of Iran back on June 22nd made the region more volatile.
Yeah.
And he basically argues it, quote, dragged us into a war with Iran.
Yeah, and he contrasts that very sharply with the Biden administration. Mearsheimer actually gives them credit for avoiding a war with Iran, even though he says the Israelis apparently tried to sort of bait them into a conflict twice in 2024.
So what's the alleged interaction there between, say, former Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump?
Well, Mearsheimer talks about their 3 recent White House meetings. He suggests they focused heavily on Gaza and Iran. According to him, Netanyahu was basically looking for Trump's permission, or at least his backing, to take action against Iran if they started enriching uranium again, and also just ensuring the U.S. would, have Israel's back.
And the situation in Gaza, Mearsheimer's take is pretty stark there too, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He suggests Netanyahu's goal is no permanent ceasefire, and his words, to ethnically cleanse as much as possible Gaza and even the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Mearsheimer, Trump seems fully on board with that.
It sounds like this dependence on the U.S., this patron relationship, or Uncle Sugar, as Mearsheimer puts it, driven by the donor class, it just creates this awful loop with no obvious way out.
Exactly, a vicious cycle.
Okay, so let's pivot now from that geopolitical stage to, well, the whole Epstein-Gate situation.
Yeah.
Because the sources we looked at have some really fascinating, though sometimes conflicting ideas about Epstein's supposed intelligence connections and, what the Trump administration could or should do.
Right. Professor Mearsheimer, again, he has a very clear take, though maybe a surprising one to some. He basically says this whole imbroglio over Jeffrey Epstein, as he calls it, won't really affect U.S.-Israeli relations or the power of the lobby, not in a fundamental way.
Really? No effect?
Well, he admits it might cause some heartburn, for the Trump administration and for Israel. But he believes the relationship itself is just so solid and the lobby's power is so awesome that you'd need a major earthquake to really shake things up, more than just Trump changing his mind.
Okay, so if that's the case, what can the administration do? According to others, Mike Benz, who's looking into this deeply, he has some very specific advice, right?
Yes, he does. Benz urges the administration, specifically mentioning Pam Bondi, presumably someone in a key position, to pull and release everything related to that November 2020 Office Professional Responsibility Report, the OPR report about Epstein's 2008 plea deal.
That OPR report, wasn't that the one that came out after the Miami Herald story?
That's the one. Took 9 months, 348 pages. And Benz points out the absolute critical missing piece is the interview transcript with Alex Acosta.
Acosta, the guy who cut the original deal.
Exactly. And that transcript, Benz says it's buried in footnote 244, and it specifically deals with Epstein's alleged intelligence ties. Benz thinks releasing that would be, quote, hard forensic evidence. And he notes it lines up with Trump's recent statement, something like, whatever she thinks is credible, she should release that.
Okay, now here's where Benz's theory gets really interesting, because he pushes back on the main narrative, doesn't he? He doesn't see Epstein primarily as a blackmail operator.
Right. He puts forward this idea that Epstein was more of a financial fixer. His theory is Epstein had access to massive amounts of capital, and his real role was facilitating off-books transactions for intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
U.S., Israeli, maybe others too.
Like a private financial arm for covert ops.
Kind of. Benz can't sit to the rise of what he calls a private CIA back in the 70s and 80s. He even brings up examples like Adnan Khashoggi in the Iran-Contra affair.
Wow. And he has evidence for Epstein meeting with intelligence figures.
Well, he highlights that even Bill Burns, the current CIA director, met Epstein 3 times in 2014.
3 times? even after Burns left the State Department.
Yes, twice at Epstein's house when Burns was at the Carnegie Endowment. Benz suggests those meetings were likely about money, donor access for the endowment. Similar, he says, to why Bill Gates reportedly met with Epstein for financial reasons.
So Epstein's specialty wasn't just the parties, it was the money structuring.
According to Benz, yes. His specialty was hiding these transactions in complicated offshore debt structurings, basically making the money trail disappear from regulators.
So the takeaway from Benz's theory, the girls, the parties, that was all about juicing the deals, creating the environment to attract powerful people for these financial arrangements rather than just blackmail.
That's his core argument, though he does concede that intelligence agencies might still, covertly use information gathered in those settings.
We should probably note, former Israeli PM Naftali Bennett flatly denied Epstein worked for Mossad, called it categorically and totally false.
Right, that denial is out there. But Benz's summary, essentially, is that Epstein was a kind of part-time deep state fixer, moving money around to help elite institutions and deep state intelligence goals.
It definitely challenges the standard story, focusing more on the mechanics of, well, covert finance.
It does, and Benz even speculates about what Ghislaine Maxwell might know, suggesting it relates specifically to these kinds of government-brokered financial deals.
Okay, fascinating stuff. And before we move on to how some of these other foreign policy challenges are playing out, just a quick reminder, if you're finding this deep dive interesting, please do hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us out, and you won't miss our future analyses. All right, so pivoting from those financial shadows Benz describes, let's turn to Ukraine. The situation there seems marked by ongoing conflict and, well, some pretty confusing statements from the administration.
Professor Mearsheimer talked about President Trump's statements on pausing weapons deliveries to Ukraine. They seemed contradictory. First, Trump said he didn't know who ordered the pause, but then later he said he knew all along what Pete was doing, presumably referring to a key official, and claimed the pause was just for evaluation.
And Mearsheimer had some strong words for that, didn't he?
He did. He called Trump's explanations gibberish and contradictory, described it as unprecedented behavior for a president. Mearsheimer's view is Trump thinks he can just fly by the seat of his pants, without really needing to think through complex issues before speaking. He even added that none of Trump's predecessors behaved this way, implying that no president playing with a full deck would behave this way.
Oof, strong words. How does Mearsheimer think someone like, say, President Putin views these kinds of statements?
He imagines Putin probably sees it similarly, focusing on the basic facts and logic of the situation on the ground, not Trump's bloviating, as Mearsheimer puts it. And speaking of the ground situation, Mearsheimer seems to agree with Scott Ritter's assessment. That very bleak analogy of Ukraine being like a hospice patient waiting to die. It suggests the military situation is incredibly dire.
Yeah, that's grim. And what about Trump's new plan for weapons delivery, going through the CIA and NATO instead of countries directly? Mearsheimer's not sold on that either, is he?
Not at all. He calls it a Rube Goldberg device, overly complicated and maybe pointless. He questions if the real purpose is just to get European countries to pay more. But crucially, he says it's unlikely to actually change anything on the battlefield. Why? Because there just aren't enough meaningful weapons like Patriot missile systems to make a real difference.
Right. He points out that nobody's actually specified what weapons are even included in this new setup.
Exactly, just vague promises. So if you tie all this together, Mearsheimer's conclusion is pretty stark. He sees Trump as flailing and frankly failing on multiple fronts: Gaza, Iran, and with Russia in Ukraine.
Despite all the talk early on about ending these conflicts quickly.
Right. Mearsheimer says none of that has happened. Instead, the U.S. has just gotten deeper and deeper into the mud. He argues pretty forcefully that it's clearly his war now, meaning Trump's war. And there's no clear story for how it ends, just leading to, quote, poisonous relations for as far as the eye can see.
Wow. Okay, so that really paints a picture of a deeply unstable global situation. What does all this Ukraine, the Middle East tension suggest about maybe broader geopolitical shifts happening?
Well, there's no question, as Mearsheimer sees it, that the U.S. is effectively at war with Russia. Maybe not boots on the ground, but he calls it an almost war, or co-belligerency.
Co-belligerency, meaning fighting on the same side, essentially, because of all the equipment being supplied.
Precisely. And here's another point Mearsheimer raises, something potentially quite alarming. It concerns Germany.
Germany? How so?
He says he doesn't fear, like, a return to German militarism, like in the World Wars, but he is concerned that if the U.S. starts pulling back its security guarantee, its nuclear umbrella, that Germany might feel compelled to get its own nuclear weapons.
Wow. And how would Russia react to that?
Well, Mearsheimer says that kind of move by Germany could really spook the Russians, seriously spook them. He even mentions that some Russian strategists are now openly talking about using nuclear weapons in certain scenarios, which reflects, a really dangerous shift in thinking compared to the late Cold War.
A shift? How so?
He points out that back then it became almost unthinkable, this idea that using nuclear weapons could ever make sense. But now, he says the possibility, while maybe not high, feels much more real than he ever thought it could be again.
So, pulling it all together, we've got these incredibly complex conflicts, this entanglement of foreign policy with potentially covert finance via figures like Epstein and leadership styles that are described as contradictory or impulsive. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do leaders, or really any of us, sort through the noise, the gibberish, as Mearsheimer calls it, to understand what's actually happening? And what kind of leadership even works in an age that feels so uncertain and, frankly, dangerous? It feels like maybe our old ways of understanding global power need a rethink. Well, that's all the time we have for this particular deep dive. We really hope it gave you some valuable insights, or at least plenty to think about. And if you haven't already, please do remember to hit that like button and subscribe to our show. It helps others find us. Thank you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod.